Welcome into the Sports Hub Patriots podcast. I'm Alex Barth from 98.5, 98.5thesportshub.com, coming to you after day one of Patriots OTAs. And joining us today to go over today's OTA practice, Taylor Kyles from CLNS Media. Taylor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, buddy. I'm looking forward to it. It was a fun day of practice. It's always good being out there anyway, but getting to see the veterans and the young guys out there at the same time. Obviously we'll get into it with the rotations and everything, but it was still just cool seeing everybody on the field at once.
So that all being said, we have to put the caveat on all of this. That is, it was one unpadded practice very early in the process. I hate to, first of all, if you know who I am, this probably, and who Taylor is, frankly, this doesn't surprise you. If you came here to hear this player is great, this player sucks, it's not what we're doing. You can't really do it after that kind of practice. What they were doing didn't have a lot of direct football application. This is, they're installing the offense. They're working on basic fundamentals, technique, things like that. The value it doesn't mean there's no value in these practices, though. The value in these practices is it sets the stage for when we get to the he's great, he sucks practices down the road in the summer. Who's competing for what spot, who's close to who's maybe not as close, who was more involved than we thought, who was less involved than we thought, was anybody maybe playing a position a little different than we thought. There is value in all of that. Absolutely. So that's what we're going to get to today. And Taylor, we'll start off, of course, at the quarterback position where Jacoby Brissett saw most of the reps. Not surprising. Veterans across the board seem to have the edge today in taking snaps. But after Brissett in the rotation, they stuck to the same rotation pretty much all day. It was Bailey Zappi, then Drake Maye, then Joe Milton. Not surprising. You're going to put the rookies at the end of the depth chart to start. That sometimes happens. But where do you see Maye at relative to Jacoby Brissett and Bailey Zappi?
Well, Jacoby, I think, was like the clear-cut number one. I think if the season started tomorrow, Jacoby's your starter, and you're not thinking twice about it. That said, Bailey Zappi was kind of on fire early on when they were throwing into the nets, going through footwork drills. I think he missed like one pass. I was pretty impressed. Then you started to see more of what we've seen recently from Bailey Zappi in camp where, the accuracy is inconsistent. I remember when they had the paddles up to simulate batted passes or defensive linemen putting their arms up. That was one where we didn't see the ball come out very often. It just seemed like he was uncomfortable. So relative to Drake Maye, who wasn't consistent, like the underneath accuracy is spotty. There are times where the ball is behind guys. We already knew that coming in. That's his biggest area where he needs to improve in terms of the accuracy. But the downfield stuff is as advertised. Him and Joe Milton, the ball flies out of their hands, and it is accurate. So you see a little bit more there, whereas Zappi, it just wasn't enough from what you'd expect from a veteran. Now, still learning the offense. He's on his third offense in as many years. Really tough position to be in. But I think if you were going based purely on merit, it would be hard to say that Drake Maye wasn't really the second best quarterback. Again, I cannot emphasize enough. Huge grain of salt. Like these guys are still learning the offense. We even saw with the receivers and team drills, there was some inconsistency, like, guys not getting separation, stuff like that. That'll become more important once we get into the padded practices and really see these guys compete with the offense under them a bit more. But I did think that, Zappi didn't impress me very much, but I did like what I saw from Drake overall throughout the practice. And then Joe Milton struggled early on with the just footwork and throwing into the net drills. And then was kind of up and down in the limited reps he got. I think that's also important to remember is the young guys weren't getting many opportunities. The only time you really could tell that Drake Maye was the incumbent starter long-term was when they split the units in half and we saw Jacoby Brissett and then Drake Maye. On the other field, it was Bailey Zappi, Joe Milton, and, coaching staff and team members that seem like they're more backups. But yeah, Jacoby, clear-cut number one quarterback. And then I think Drake Maye was probably your second best guy on fewer opportunities than Bailey Zappi did get.
The interesting thing to me will be how they balance, and I don't think it would surprise anybody at this point if Jacoby Brissett is the week one starter. Obviously, Drake Maye is going to take over eventually, and kind of what we'll figure out over the next few weeks and months is how long is eventually, right? Is it a couple weeks, couple months, whatever? But what they're going to have to really balance here is getting Jacoby Brissett ready for the season while also working on Drake Maye's development. And I think you saw an interesting balance of that today where in the individual drills, it was footwork. And that shouldn't surprise anybody. Alex Van Pelt, big footwork guy. He's leading the quarterback development, even though TC McCartney is technically the quarterback's coach. But then when they went in a team, which is generally more that kind of preparation thing rather than a fundamental thing, it was Jacoby Brissett. But I do want to bring it back to that individual real quick here, Taylor, because you are somebody that takes a closer look at mechanics. Footwork it's Alex Van Pelt's strength as a coach. It's also probably the most knocked part of Drake Maye's game coming out of college. He said he worked on it leading up to the draft. He's now had a couple of weeks with them here in Foxborough. What did you think of his footwork today?
Yeah, so when you looked at UNC's offense last season, the way that it was constructed, more of an air raid style offense where you're basically throwing the grass. It's not like the West Coast where every step kind of tells you where to go in your progression. It was more like a vibes-based offense, for lack of a better term, for Drake Maye in college. What happened a lot of the time was because there wasn't a huge emphasis on footwork, you'd see a really inconsistent base that really hurt his throwing. It's not even so much that, he had one flaw or another. It was just you'd see different things based on the drop back. And that's where accuracy is really affected. You really just want guys to be comfortable. Now, in terms of individual things that you didn't love in Drake Maye's tape in college, there's a lot of heel clickiness where you'd have one foot overlapping with the other. You'd see sometimes his base would be really narrow, which doesn't allow you to put as much power into throws, and then you end up using more of your upper body, different things like that. What I saw and what we've been seeing really in the past couple of practices that we watched was there was more consistency and I think a deliberate attempt to try to make sure that he was getting accustomed to Alex Van Pelt's footwork. At times, it felt like there was urgency, but it also felt like the steps were really just so he could get that muscle memory down rather than Jacoby, who you can tell he's repped this a lot. It looked really natural to him. It wasn't the same, but you did see that wider base. You didn't see the heel clickiness where his feet were consistently further apart on some of those quick throws. Things like that, as it becomes more natural and he doesn't have to think about it, I think will make his accuracy on those underneath and those quick throws a little bit more consistent versus, I think there's been some other critiques of his upper body. Now, I'm not a mechanics expert. It's not something I particularly noticed where I've read from Evan Lazar and Greg Bedard that there's maybe a hitch in his shoulder. And what you like as a quarterback, you want your upper body to be linear. You don't want it to change because that can affect how the ball ends up coming out of your hand. But for the most part, I was really impressed. We heard from Drake Maye. He's putting in the work. He's been here by himself watching film. He's trying to get better. He's, doing all the things he needs to. And I do think, although the results may not be what you want, it's still very early, and it's nice to see that he's clearly taken to the coaching.
All right, Taylor, let's move on to the offensive line because we've had our debates over on CLNS about the left tackle position. Chuks Okorafor seems like the favorite to win that. He's a converted right tackle. We saw Caden Wallace mix in. He's a converted right tackle. The only other guy we saw really significantly rep at left tackle was Vidarian Lowe, who struggled last year as a true swing tackle, but as you pointed out on a show we were on a little bit earlier, did struggle more on the right side than the left side. So maybe there's something there. You heard Okorafor, and I wrote about this on 98.5thesportship.com earlier today, kind of say, it takes time to make this adjustment. How are you feeling about the left tackle position right now that we know, okay, this is who is competing for this spot?
Okorafor's answer was interesting because it was kind of the opposite of what we got from Caden Wallace when we were at the last practice, where he said, he kind of downplayed it. It seemed like it wasn't a really big deal for him. He mentioned like in practice in college, he would kind of rep there. But Okorafor actually played left tackle in college, so it's not brand new to him. But he did mention it's a new position relatively in the professional level. It's a new offense, new city. So maybe he was just being humble, trying not to set expectations too high. Like he's going to go out there and be, a really good left tackle from the jump. But that said, I still want to see how it looks in pads. We're not really able to learn very much when these guys are just playing each other in shorts and a t-shirt. So I don't want to go too far in one end or the other or what I expect from him necessarily. I will say, again, the comment was interesting, though. It seems like this is still something he's working on. But if you want to look at it, glass half full, he did specifically mention Scott Peters, the offensive line coach who worked under Brian Callahan, who's one of the few people you can put on Scar's level in terms of offensive line coaches in history. Big emphasis on technique from Scott Peters. He played the position. He has an entire business outside of football dedicated to helping offensive linemen with technique. And he mentioned that in the past, he hasn't really had coaches that put as much of an emphasis on the technique as does Scott Peters. So you're hoping that makes the transition a little bit easier. But regardless of what happens, it's going to be something we have to watch because, like you said, two guys who are converting to the other side. For some people, it's not that big of a deal. For others, like Marshall Newhouse, that's the main guy we always talk about, where for him, it was a big deal and it was very difficult. It's not the same for everybody. So we'll see how it goes once they put the pads on and we're really seeing these trench guys get to work. But, I guess if you were hoping that he was going to tell you something that made you feel better, you didn't really get that.
Yeah, I think it's Peters is the big unknown here, right? And like you said, we really can't judge linemen specifically. I know we said we weren't going to make a ton of evaluations off today's practice, like quarterbacks, footwork, right? We can talk about that. It's not the be all end all, but we can talk about it. Linemen, you really can't until the pads come on. You just can't. And we'll see. That's going to be a weekend at camp. We'll see where Scott Peters has him at that point. But it does feel like the Patriots are putting a ton of trust in Scott Peters specifically when it comes to getting things set at left tackle. Anything else stand out to you today among the offensive linemen?
Tonio Mafi got pretty, I don't want to say significant like it was a lot, but it was way more than I expected. He got some run at center, snapping the ball. Now, last year, he seemed like a guard-only prospect, but in this Scott Peters and Alex Van Pelt offense, we do know that they tend to have more of an emphasis on cross-training offensive linemen because, especially in this game, the modern day where you don't get a lot of opportunities, attrition, you lose one offensive lineman, that can be huge. Having guys who can play multiple roles is very important. So we saw Mafi play on the left side, play on the right side. But if he can be solid at center, that makes him, I think, significantly more valuable than a guy who struggled at the guard spots. Maybe you put him in a position where he doesn't really have to be on an island quite as often. Besides that, I also thought it was interesting to see Sidy Sow, who spent last season as a right guard, play more on the left side of the offensive line, which is his natural spot in college. That's where he was, really only on the left side, although he was mostly a guard, played some tackle. But that was really his home on that left side of the offensive line. I like that move, especially if the plan is to have Nick Leverett, who is the main right guard for the offense. And then you saw Layden Robinson get some run there. If your plan is to have Layden Robinson as your right guard, then Sidy Sow as your left guard, all of this is, depending on what happens with Cole Strange, who we learned is week to week or month to month. Sounds like he's going to probably start the season on PUP and maybe have to fight for his roster spot or placed on the depth chart once he gets back. But I like the idea of Sidy Sow if Layden Robinson does establish himself, or even Nick Leverett, somebody who has a lot of NFL experience on very good teams, played with the Buccaneers and with Tom Brady. I don't really mind that combination. And then if Layden Robinson can prove that he deserves to be a starter, I think that's a really physical, athletic combination of guards. Obviously, Sidy Sow more athletic than what you're going to get from Layden Robinson, but he's got a good first step. The length and the hand strength are things I think make up for his lack of mirroring skills. So those are kind of the big notes I thought. Mafi getting snaps at center, and then Sidy Sow being more on the left side as opposed to the right like we saw last season.
All right, so I know on top of that, you were very interested in the wide receiver workload that we saw today, and Taylor's full observations you can check out on clnsmedia.com. But Taylor, so we've broken this down in a number of different ways. We have Pop Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, 2 rookies. Those guys are roster locks. KJ Osborne, it feels like if he doesn't make the roster, it's because they're only keeping 4 receivers, right? If they keep a 5th, he's got over 75% of his contract guaranteed. I think it's like $3.2 million of his $4 million contracts guaranteed. So he's probably making the team. This is all pending injury, of course. So then you have a potential 6th spot, or if there is an injury, a 5th spot coming down to the guys we know from last year who just were never quite good enough. Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyquan Thornton, Jalen Reagor. These are the guys that are battling it out here for what we think is the last spot. Juju talked to us after practice. Very interesting. Said that, he was never more than 60% last year. He's 100% now. We saw Tyquan go out there, perform well. He always kind of performs well in this setting without pads. Did well last year. Reagor, to me, is an interesting one. I would not count him out, especially because of his kick return threat. They didn't do any special teams today, so we didn't get to do that. But it does feel like they're going to give those 3 guys and maybe some others, Taylor, a chance to truly compete for roster spot, even if that roster spot ultimately may not end up existing, that being, the 6th receiver on the roster.
Yeah, with Kendrick Bourne out, I thought the rotation at receiver was very interesting. The starting X was Tyquan Thornton. Now, we've been kind of acknowledging that he's probably someone who's on the fringe if we're looking at the wide receiver depth chart. So to see him that early, you wonder if Kendrick Bourne comes in, is he going to be the X? Does KJ Osborne go to X and KB's at Z? Those things are a bit confusing, but Thornton and KJ Osborne being at the top of the rotation was something I took note of, especially given Juju's comment about being 100%. I thought that he was getting less run than someone who's an established veteran who has a proven track record, who if he's 100%, okay, you're getting the guy who's good after the catch and can be a good contested catch guy. You'd think you'd want him more in the rotation, but we were seeing like Jalen Reagor was the backup X, and I was seeing like even Kawan Baker, and then at times Jalen Polk really rotating at Z, with Juju more in the mix than someone who it felt like was an established member of that rotation. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Also in 3 receiver sets, you saw like Pop Douglas. I think that's just his role. I don't think they really want him out there in base groupings because he is an undersized guy. You don't love him as a blocker necessarily, but obviously a really good separator, brings speed, dynamic athleticism. You want him on the field. So yeah, maybe it's a good sign for Tyquan Thornton. I do think they have every incentive to try to find a role for him. He brings speed that you don't have elsewhere. But then to your point, Jalen Reagor, one, brings return value that Thornton doesn't bring. But at the same time, last year he did show that he could be a vertical threat for the offense and was on the field more consistently than a Tyquan Thornton, who really hasn't proven anything in the NFL. So the way that whole position works out, especially once the young guys get more opportunities and we see, the young and old kind of mix a little bit more rather than the veteran heavy rotation we saw today, I'm definitely going to be keeping a close eye on who's getting more opportunities and maybe if we see more from Juju as these practices go on. Because if he gives you what we expected last season, then really I think he does maybe fight for a roster spot, force you to keep 5-6 guys. But I don't really understand why he wasn't more prominently featured.
Do you think it's true that he was never more than 60% last year?
I would hope so, considering what we saw. Like, we were out there day one, like, ooh, this guy is not the same receiver that we thought we were going to get. And obviously, he didn't really have a good game until the Steelers when he did start to finally look like himself. And we know coming off ACLs, it usually takes it takes one full season for you to start feeling like yourself again. So you're hoping that's what we get from him. But yeah, I would certainly hope that he wasn't anywhere near 100% last year, because if that's, the best you're going to get out of him, I'm not sure that there's any shot he's going to make the roster.
All right, on defense, the big battle on the defensive side of the ball is at cornerback. Christian Gonzalez is going to be back as cornerback 1. He was back out there today. Was probably limited a little bit. He did 7-on-7s. He didn't do 11-on-11s. Remember, he's working his way back from a shoulder injury he suffered early last year, but he looked good. He was moving good. I think he might have put some weight on, which I think is good for him. Jonathan Jones was out there. Didn't take part a ton. I think that just might be a veteran thing, but the little bit he did, right? So we wondered, is he going to be back on the boundary or is he going to move into the slot now that Miles Bryant's going to go back to being the full-time slot corner? Very brief, so I wouldn't, use a pen to write this, but it does seem like he's going back to the outside. That'd leave Marcus Jones as your slot corner, but now it's all right. Who's next up on the boundary? And there, there's a whole list of players that are competing for that, but you talk about, we're hammering this usage. Who was on the field? Who was getting the reps? There are a few guys that got more consistent reps on either side of the ball today than Alex Austin and Marco Wilson. And it feels like whether it's those two battling for the third corner spot, whether they're going to be 3 and 4, it feels like they like those guys. I'd say specifically with Austin, I think there's a lot to like. He came in last year late. It was right around Thanksgiving. And this is a major credit to Mike Pellegrino. Did a great job coaching him up. He was ready and he made plays late in the year. He picked off Josh Allen late in the year. I'm glad they're giving him another chance because he's a guy I think can be a little bit more than a depth guy. I don't think I'm not going to put him in Malcolm Butler, JC Jackson, Jonathan Jones found this guy out of nowhere territory, but I think he can be a solid player. So I'm glad to see he's getting the opportunity. Then Marco Wilson, draft bust-ish guy. And, he's played for a couple teams and now he's here, but definitely a guy that has some natural ability.
Yeah, I've seen people pining for Stephon Gilmore to be signed, which I understand.
I still wouldn't rule that out.
And I think he's going to be a guy, if they do add him, it'll be late in summer once they see the competition that they have at corner and say, okay, maybe we don't have enough. But for me, it's in Mike Pellegrino we trust. If they didn't have a corner coach who I was so confident in, I probably wouldn't feel as good about the whole situation behind Christian Gonzalez, Jonathan Jones, if Marcus Jones is someone who can consistently be available. I'm not sure that's the case. But Pellegrino, like you said, does such a great job with these guys. Alex Austin comes in, plays well. Marco Wilson, I think, only played in one game for the Pats. It was that last game of the season, and even he made a couple plays. So I've been saying I like the competition they've got because you got those two guys. You got Isaiah Bolden. You have young, physically talented players. Also Marcellus Dial. I think you want to see how these young guys acquit themselves. Alex Austin, though, I have him penciled in if you do kick John Jones back into the slot as the top outside corner across from Christian Gonzalez, because the play he made on Josh Allen was not normal. One, it showed preparation, obviously good coaching to put him in position, but then to execute it on the field on a deep throw was very impressive. I really want to see more from him. When I dove into his tape, there were things you could nitpick. Like there were a couple plays in the first couple games he played for New England where I think he missed out on some assignments. He let up a couple touchdowns, but they weren't easy. It wasn't like, oh my God, how's this guy on an NFL field? It's like, all right, he's just learning the system. I understand. As it went on, he was super solid. And I thought he was a guy where it's like, yeah, I'd like to see what you can get from him, especially because he was a rookie last season. And the fact that he primarily played on the defense's left side. Now, typically in camp, you really see guys stick to sides. It's not a whole lot of boundary versus field, or you take this guy. You're trying to get the basics down. You tend to see the guys on the defensive left side as the top corner because most quarterbacks are left-handed. So if they're looking to that side, you want it to be your top corner they're throwing to most often. So with Alex Austin being the main guy in that role because Christian Gonzalez was out, thought that was significant and maybe hinted they see him as that top, number 2, number 3, whatever boundary corner. So we'll see how everything works out. Like you said, it's very early. We don't know how these rotations are going to look, a month from now, even a week from now. But I'm an Alex Austin fan, so to see him in that position got me pretty excited. That's going to be one of the more underrated battles to watch in terms of entertainment because it's a lot of young talent there.
And it's not one where I think there's some battles where it's I don't want to say what's the term I'm looking for here? I don't want to say like a battle of regression where it's just like, all right, well, somebody's got to win this, right? This is one where I think you have like multiple. I don't want to say like none of these guys are necessarily proven, but Alex Austin feels like has some actual upside. Marco Wilson feels like has some actual upside. Isaiah Bolden is another guy who will be in this conversation. Feels like he has, he can be an NFL player. To what extent, I don't know, but these are young guys, good athletes, have, potentially some untapped ability there. That's fun. Whereas you look like we kind of talked about left tackle before, a bunch of right tackles trying to play a position they haven't played in years. It's framed a lot differently, right? So I think that one's going to be fun. It seems like we might have potentially a little bit of a battle shaping up at safety as well. I don't know that it's a battle, but it's like you're going to have if Duggar and Peppers are going to be on the roster, right? Marte Mop, who's going to be on the roster, but the question is a safety or a linebacker? But I thought they gave Jalen Hawkins, the free agent they signed from Atlanta, some decent reps today, and he's wearing 32. So he obviously looks a little bit like Devin McCourty. They're playing him in that role a little bit. Too early to tell. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, yeah, Jalen Hawkins is going to be on the roster. But I'm somebody who's talked a lot about wanting them to add a true free safety. He took some of those reps today. He was more involved than maybe I thought he'd be. He's somebody I'll be watching a little bit closer when we get back out there next week.
Yeah, like he was on the field with Joshua Bledsoe, who I think is solid. But anytime you're on the field with Bledsoe, I feel like you got to take with a grain of salt what that means. But Hawkins does have experience as a center fielder, so it's definitely not nothing. In terms of like Mapu, I'm still on the band of, I think he's a safety. I think you can play a linebacker in this defense as a safety. Like their big nickel, that was where Marte Mapu really was in the box more often. Though I'd like to see him more as like the tight end eraser type. And we did see that when they had him, Duggar, and Peppers on the field at the same time. Duggar was in the deep middle, which I didn't love, but you did see Peppers down near the line of scrimmage against the tight ends, which I think is more his role. I'd also like to see him play more on the post and have better instincts there in the second year. We'll see how that plays out. But yeah, that fourth safety spot will be interesting. I don't think anybody's jumping Mapu, but Bledsoe and Hawkins, we saw Jalen Mills did get a decent amount of run last season. Like he wasn't just a special team, right. He actually got to play. So it's not a nothing position, especially for a defense that tends to use three safeties as much as they can. So we'll see how it plays out. I wouldn't put too much stock into Hawkins or Bledsoe at this point. I think the top three are solidified, but players seem to love Bledsoe. Like anything I hear from him doesn't really match what I've seen. So maybe he's better in practice than he gets a chance to show. But yeah, we'll see.
All right, as we wrap it up here, again, Taylor Kyles, CLNS Media. Anything else stand out for you today?
That's about it. Trying to think of anything significant news-wise.
I mean, we touched on just about every position. Tight end, defensive line.
I know Christian Barmore, he was asked what was different from this year's scheme versus last. He mentioned things we've heard, like pass rush has been a big area of emphasis, but he also mentioned four-man fronts, which was interesting because Jerry Montgomery, the defensive line coach, is coming from Green Bay, where they tend to use odd fronts, kind of like the Patriots do. Odd front just means it's like that 3-4 style of defense where you got the 3 big guys clogging up the middle and then 2 athletic outside linebackers. But in those fronts, you tend to have one true edge rusher, and the guy on the other side is usually a bigger body who's playing more contained than actually rushing. I think that maybe hurts the Patriots at some points because you don't really have the athleticism off both ends. Whereas in the 4-man fronts, you have your 2 big guys in the middle and then 2 true edge rushers on each side of the line of scrimmage. And if you do want a better pass rush, naturally, that would probably be the front you want to lean on more in pass rush or sub-package situations. So don't want to look too deep into it again because it would be a bit of a departure from what Jerry Montgomery's done in the past. But this is a DeMarcus Covington defense. He's running the show. Right. And Jerry Montgomery, this is still a multiple front. He has experience coaching different styles of defense. So that's going to be one thing I'm looking out for. But, that's probably the big thing that stood out for me.
He is Taylor Kyles from CLNS Media. You can check out all his work, clnsmedia.com, the Patriots Daily Podcast. Taylor, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, buddy.
We'll be back. Another practice next week. I believe it's Wednesday that they are open to the media, so we'll have another show then. Until then, for more, check out 985thesportshub.com and the Sports Hub YouTube page. I'm Alex Barth.